Okay, here we go. Feel free to get food, and I certainly won't be upset as you guys come and go. But if you stay, I'm going to hold off questions until the end. Now, volunteers, they're the lifeblood, the backbone of so many nonprofits. But often, nonprofits don't appreciate the risks involved. They're taken for granted, sometimes mismanaged, and we've all had those difficult volunteers. So I'm going to try to do 3 different things today. Okay. One of which is going to be that this will work. Here we go. Here we go. So I had a law professor at OSU who was always very ambitious and said, these are the 3 things we're going to do, and he'd give 3 things with subparts, and we'd be lucky to get through 1. Hopefully we'll get through all 3 today. So we're going to start with talking about special insurance concerns about nonprofit volunteers, then go to drafting and enforcing volunteer policies, and finally dealing with difficult volunteers. No? Yes? Okay, here we go. So volunteers, all of your volunteers should expect to be covered under your entity's insurance policy, whether it's a general liability or to have a special rider for volunteers. And even when those individual volunteers are covered by your insurance, your organization may still have liability. Okay, volunteers are generally not covered by workers' compensation, which makes sense because they're not employees. Your general liability policy should include volunteers as additional insureds, and a lot of insurance companies that specialize in nonprofits, such as Philadelphia, that's written into the policy. But if you're not going with a general liability policy that involves or specializes in nonprofits, make sure you talk to your insurance professional. Make sure that your volunteers are covered under your policy. Now, volunteers may also have additional coverage under their own personal homeowners or renters insurance. Now, above and beyond your insurance policy for the individual volunteers, there are 2 laws, one state, one federal, that protect volunteers. They're the Federal Volunteer Protection Act and Ohio Revised Code 2305.38. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the specific laws, but basically, this is what they do. They protect uncompensated volunteers who are properly licensed and certified and authorized by state law. So for instance, if you've hired a volunteer or you have a volunteer that is driving someone, you need to make sure that they have a driver's license. They need to be for a nonprofit organization or a governmental agency, and they need to act within the volunteer scope of responsibility. So no freelancing. If they've got a specific job title or duties, they've got to be doing that, not something, some frolic of some sort. And it covers ordinary acts of negligence, which basically means honest mistakes. It does not cover willful or criminal conduct, gross negligence, reckless misconduct. These are a lot of legal buzzwords, but basically when they're purposely doing something wrong, or if they're driving their car without a license, they're volunteering for a business, not a government agency or a nonprofit. A couple examples. In California, there was a nonprofit that had a road race, and they had a volunteer that was driving contestants out to various checkpoints. They didn't do a background check on that individual. Turned out that he did not have a license to drive a car because of 2 previous DWIs, and he was intoxicated while driving those people out there. He got into a wreck. 4 participants got injured, and that entity was sued to the tune of about $2 million. For simplistic sake, or for time's sake, I'm going to cut out some of the other stories I have, but needless to say, there are a lot of things that have happened to nonprofits over the years. In any case, the organization itself is not exempt under those laws. And for that reason, you need to have a very good volunteer policy. Now, the volunteer policy, we've got a sample volunteer policy in your packets from the nonprofitnetwork.org. It's very small print. I apologize. We were trying to squeeze it all in. It's really a guideline. It is not something that you can just take and say, this is mine. Every single volunteer policy should be crafted carefully for your organization. It should clarify each volunteer's role, responsibility, and obligations, basically a job title for your volunteers. It should establish the values, beliefs, culture, and direction of your organization for the volunteer. For instance, growing up, my mother was the executive director of the American Lung Association of Western New York. They had a volunteer policy that said, you can't smoke while you're volunteering. Makes sense, it's part of their culture. Each of you have your own culture, your own beliefs, your own purpose. Incorporate that into your volunteer policy. Volunteer policy ensures continuity. There's lots of people that come and go from volunteer organizations, and you want to make sure the same rules are applied after your volunteer coordinator moves on to a different position. You also want to formalize your current practices. You don't want any unwritten rules. If you have an unwritten rule, put it into writing and incorporate it into your volunteer policy. And this is all to protect your organization. It's not to punish or to curtail what your volunteers do. It's to protect you. So here's some pre-drafting considerations. Make sure you know who is going to train and involve your volunteers. Your volunteer coordinator, your CEO, who is going to do it? What level of supervision do they need? Someone who is dealing with children needs a lot higher level of supervision than someone who is just passing out water at a road race. Again, for background checks, same thing. You have to take into consideration what that volunteer's duties are. You don't want to have someone such as that driver in California not have a background check. You should make sure that they have a license. Check anything along those lines. Make sure that you clearly identify what expenses are being reimbursed, if they're being reimbursed at all. And that's important because when you filled out your 501c3 application to the IRS, you made a declaration at that point as to whether or not you're going to be reimbursing expenses for volunteers. You need to make sure that you're consistent with that. You make sure that your expectations and the requirements for your volunteers are properly expressed. And then finally, does it contain a complaint process? That's between volunteers and each other, between the volunteers and staff, as well as your constituents and volunteers. And it needs to go both ways. Very quickly, some additional policy considerations. Dress code. Do you want your volunteers to have a dress code? Record management. You want to make sure that you keep their application if you have one. Background checks, complaints. You also want to make sure that you have their accomplishments so you can reward them. Participation requirements. Do they need a license? Do they need a background check? We had a question that came in via email about court-ordered service programs. This is a special case. There's a lot of issues involved with that I don't have time to go into today. But if that person is here, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I'm giving up on that. Yes. Training. You want to make sure that you have a full training regimen that is clear. We'll do it this way. Youth participation. There's a lot of schools that have youth volunteer programs that they're required to. You have to make sure that you get parental consent for those. And that also includes potentially waivers if there's any sort of danger. You want to make sure you recognize all of your volunteers. And then always have a conflict of interest policy. You should have one for your board of directors. It should also be similarly applied to all of your volunteers. Ways to improve your volunteer experience. Again, create a well-reasoned orientation program. Provide for them meaningful work. Recognize their involvement and contributions, whether it's through t-shirts, hats, coffee mugs, or an awards ceremony. Think long-term. Often, your volunteers will become your best and most loyal advocates and donors. But sometimes, you have a difficult volunteer. And I'll ask, for those who have volunteers for their program, who's encountered a difficult volunteer? It's pretty much unanimous. You can't always control who volunteers, but you can control how they volunteer. You have to recognize that they need to be managed just like an employee, and the volunteer policy that you've carefully crafted and discussed, you must enforce that consistently. You cannot play favorites. So, some difficult volunteers can cause all sorts of problems. I'll just read these through. They can cause factions, dissent, gossip, resentment, loss of potential, frustration, low morale, and impact an organization's reputation in the community. Now, I was looking through the internet and I found all sorts of horror stories about volunteers and difficult volunteers. But I decided to go overseas to choose one in particular, so I wasn't pointing the finger at anyone that might be in this room. So, Autism Northern Ireland and its volunteer support group. Autism Northern Ireland had a quasi-independent volunteer group that literally went to its constituents' houses on a daily or weekly basis. A new CEO came into the parent organization and tried to actually enforce the volunteer policy programs that they had. And there was complete revolt by the volunteer support group. They got the press involved. They said that they were hurting their constituents. They got some politicians involved. And the splashback on Autism Northern Ireland was tremendous. If I remember correctly, they lost almost 60% of their donors and more than 70% of the dollars that they had from the previous year during their annual fundraising. Don't let that happen to you. So, some of the things you want to make sure you do. Never, ever ignore a difficult volunteer. You need to also understand and take time to understand what the problem is. Is it a character issue? Is it a competency issue? Or is it a chemistry issue? And each of those issues have their own set of solutions. Some other underlying reasons. They might have a lack of understanding of the organizational mission or the tasks that you've assigned them. That goes back to your training. Make sure that they're trained properly. They might have a differing view of what should be done or how it should be done. This is especially true with experienced volunteers who might be coming from one organization to a new one. They'll say, oh, back when I was working over there, we did it this way and it worked great. They're not there. They're at your organization. You are in charge. You already have your policies. You have to explain to them, this is the way we do it here. There's also a fear of change. When you have a change coming up, you need to incorporate your volunteers, not necessarily in the decision making, but at least the planning process. Prepare them for changes that you're going to have. If you're going to be radically changing what the volunteers' duties are, you need to explain that to them up front. The chances of losing volunteers or having them become disgruntled are higher the less you involve them in those changes. So now we go to potential steps in dealing with a difficult volunteer. Again, never ignore them. Speak privately with them if that's what you need to do. Just the volunteer coordinator or whoever is in charge of managing them, and address the problem one-on-one. Always be proactive. Keep those volunteers informed, as I've said. If it doesn't work, that initial private conversation, perhaps you need to go and engage in mutual problem solving where it's appropriate. Use your volunteer policy as a guidance. Again, consistently use your volunteer policy. Try to find a good, agreeable corrective action. Follow up. Make sure that they are coming around to what you believe their expectations are. And if all else fails, you have to fire them. And in those steps, you can go with the re's. Before you fire them, try reassigning them. Try retraining them. Try revitalizing them. Your volunteers get burned out just as every staff member can get burned out. go ahead, give them a break, assign them to something that's less strenuous, or just say, thank you so much. Why don't you take a little time off and come back in 3 weeks when you've revitalized yourself. You can also refer them, and I'm sure you'll get some dirty looks, but you can always say, perhaps you'd be better off at this organization than ours. And then retire them, a pleasant way of saying firing them. And yes, you can fire a volunteer. Matter of fact, you should have a policy and procedure in place in your volunteer policy that includes policies for volunteer issues, a way to inform the volunteers about that policy, make it just like your employee handbook, have them sign off on it. And then you need to have a way to measure when a volunteer is failing. Investigate and make a determination of your decision to let them go, and then have an application of that decision. Termination meetings, never pleasant. It's one of the hardest things anyone can possibly do. You're firing someone who is volunteering their time, and it can be very uncomfortable, but you have to conduct it just like you would with an employee. You do it in private. You don't make a scene. You don't want to be alone with that individual when you're terminating them. It should be perhaps the CEO and the HR manager, or the volunteer manager and some other person, but don't go in there alone, because that just comes up with a he said, she said situation that you don't want. Be direct and absolute. Don't string it out, don't argue, and don't counsel. Document everything. There are some nonprofits that actually have something for a volunteer to sign off on saying that they are resigning. And then follow up with a letter confirming the organization's decision to their mailing address. You need to take all those steps, because just like there are disgruntled employees that have left, there are disgruntled volunteers that have been terminated, and there have been cases in which they have sued their nonprofit. So to wrap up, recognize the risks in using volunteers. You need an organizational specific volunteer policy. You need to enforce that policy consistently. Engage your volunteers when making changes that affect their roles. Always recognize their achievements. Never ignore a volunteer that has a problem, and don't be afraid to retire them.